Okay, go for it.
All right. David, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed for this Oral History of HBEST project. It's fitting for me to interview you. I heard about the Human Behavior and Evolution Society from you. You hosted it at Binghamton University, I think in 1993, if I recall.
That's right. That's when we hosted the annual meeting in 1993. Were you there then?
I was not. I didn't join Binghamton until 94. When I found out about EvPsych, Ralph Miller sent me over to Science 3 to talk to you.
Right.
And then you told me about the conference and indoctrinated me into the field. So it's delightful.
Although, as we will see during this conversation, I'm somewhat of an outlaw among outlaws at the HBEST Society. So that'll come through in our conversation.
I'm looking forward to it. So we'll start off first is, can you tell us where you received your doctorate from and in what discipline?
I got my doctorate at Michigan State University in zoology, and at that time I was transitioning from an aquatic ecologist to an all-purpose evolutionary biologist.
Okay. And what prompted you to begin thinking about human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, or who prompted you to do so?
Well, first, I think that I got my degree at a time that ecology, evolution, and behavior were fusing as disciplines. They all have different historical origins, but they became fused at about the time that I was in graduate school, and that made it a very exciting time. Today we have many departments are called EEB departments, in recognition of the fact that these fields have fused. And I guess maybe by happenstance, I became interested in the altruism question, even as an undergraduate, before even coming to graduate school. And that question of basically how does niceness evolve in all of its forms lends itself to the study of humans. And so at the same time that I was learning what it meant to be an evolutionary biologist, which basically means using the same conceptual framework to study all traits in all species, it was easy for me to add humans to that list. And another factor, which I've written about, is that my dad was a novelist, and so I was kind of used to pondering the human condition. And when I saw that I could do that through an evolutionary lens, it was very attractive to me. So I got my degree, my PhD, at the same year that Ed Wilson published Sociobiology. And when I read the last chapter of his book in manuscript form, because by then I was at Harvard as a postdoc, I didn't see anything wrong with that chapter. In fact, it surprised me that it created a fuss. But as a graduate student, I was very much oriented towards studying humans along with all other species.
Was it an intellectually lonely time for you as a biologist to study humans from an evolutionary perspective? Were you shunned for doing so at all?
Not really, because it wasn't the main event for me. I always was, basically my stock in trade was evolutionary biology. And even my work on group selection didn't make me feel lonely because, for one thing, it was the good fight, so I always kind of took that stance. And for another thing, I always had my empirical work, which was, some of it had to do with group selection, but some of it had to do with other topics. And so that made me mainstream. And I also never had difficulty getting jobs, tenure track jobs. My career advancement has always been just fine. So lonely is not the word I would use, but that's in part because I didn't make it my main event until much later.
What were some of the other animals you studied besides humans early on?
Well, I began with zooplankton, and then I spent 8 years studying burying beetles, which is a carrion beetle, and the symbiotic mites that ride on their backs. So Darwin spent that many years studying barnacles, and I did my time on burying beetles and phoretic mites, and I've studied fish, individual differences in fish, which was not a group selection question, numerous insects, and so that's what's so marvelous about being an evolutionist, is that you can really, the world is your oyster.
Who were some of your key supporters when you started studying the human animal?
Humans in particular, that's a good question, and you'll see that I'm pausing. One of the things that we're going to be getting to is that when evolutionary psychology made the scene, I really took a contrarian position, and I've always described myself as having a love-hate relationship with evolutionary psychology, and that includes, for example, Lita Cosmides and John Tooby's work, which was the real hot stuff at the time that we organized the conference in 1993. And I've always said I have a love-hate relationship with that stuff. I love it, believe me. But it's also partial. The problem with it is that it is partial. And so I was always opposing, in a sense, some of the movements, or I would like to say trying to round it out. So it's not as if I had, heroes or anything like that. I greatly admired and still admire the work of Daly and Wilson. And of course, there's, the giants, Hamilton, G.C. Williams, Dawkins. I have my own separate relationships with all those folks that goes beyond humans, basically, because really we're talking about evolution, aren't we? And then humans is one exceptionally interesting species. So my relationships with the giants, Trevor's too, all has to do with evolution writ large, not just evolution in human affairs.
You mentioned some of the giants, and the reason Catherine Salmon and I are doing this oral history of HBEST is that some of the giants are no longer with us.
Right.
And so many of the new generation are never going to be able to hear their voices firsthand. And I know you have a personal relationship with some of them that have passed, including G.C. Williams. Do you have any insights into them, any personal stories that you don't think would be common knowledge about someone like George Williams or Bill Hamilton?
Not spending too much time on it, but first of all, I love your project, and I'm so happy that you're gathering these oral histories. There's something to avoid in any scientific field, and that's hero worship. Mm-hmm. And many scientific fields engage in hero worship, and I think that's to their detriment, because no one is really a giant in the sense that everyone is fallible. Marlene Zook, who worked with Hamilton very closely, and you might be interviewing Marlene. I hope you do, actually, because she knew Hamilton very well. And one thing she said about Bill Hamilton was that he wasn't right more than anyone else. He just had 10 times as many ideas as anyone else. And so he was like 10 times more right, but also 10 times more wrong. And there's a huge tendency for revisionism in science, and that's something else to be avoided. So some watershed intellectual event happens, and then the proponents of that turn into heroes, basically, that are right in every respect, and the losers turn out to be fools and dunces. That makes you wonder how they ever could have thought what they did, and that's just like poor scholarship. So I think that when you look at the giants, Dawkins, Williams, Hamilton, all those folks, when you look at them as people, they become ever so much more interesting. Now, my greatest affection is for George Williams, because very early in my career, before when I was actually traveling to Harvard to interest Ed Wilson in publishing my first article on group selection, I stopped by George Williams' office at Stony Brook, and I can still scarcely believe I did this because I was just a grad student, but I marched into his office and I said, I'm going to convince you about group selection. And he offered me a postdoc on the spot. And so that to me is like science the way it should be. We were intellectually at opposite poles, but we were very friendly with each other. And so I think that George is the most wonderful person that way. And many people love George for that reason. Another point to make about George and Bill Hamilton is that they were very shy people and not good public speakers. Kind of disappointments, frankly, if you've ever heard their talks. Hamilton was like, a true eccentric. And I think that their shyness actually in some ways contributed to their hero status, because basically the people did not stand in the way. The personage could develop in the minds of others, and the real person was not going to say, "Hey, wait a minute." And Hamilton, I think, deserves my greatest respect for changing his mind about group selection, and that is clearly preserved in his own biography, his own autobiography, in which he said, originally I thought of inclusive fitness theory as an alternative to group selection. Then I met George Price, and I realized I was wrong, and I wrote about it in 1975. And it's taken, well, even now, there are some people that have not done what Hamilton did. So there's a few stories about Hamilton and Williams. There's others. And by the way, when George had began to have Alzheimer's and was losing his memory, I and my wife Ann Clark and Will Provine, the great historian of evolution, we took that moment to actually travel and visit George, and we interviewed him for a period of 2 days.
Wow.
And that interview is available, an extended interview on George Williams' life and thoughts at a time when he was still able to recollect them. Wow. So we have that archive to make available, and so that can be added to the archive that you are assembling.
That would be tremendous. Is that on Evolution, This View of Life?
No, it would predate an Evolution, This View of Life, and so I'll provide information for where that's available.
That's great. And one last story about George. I remember many years ago you shared a story with me about when you visited him. He had a sign, something about superorganisms being welcome.
Right. So he had a place up in Canada that was that caused him to pass through Binghamton, and so they would frequently stay at our house. And then we went to Stony Brook and stayed at their house, and he parked his lawnmower in front of his driveway with a sign that said "Superorganisms welcome here," and that still hangs on my laboratory door.
That's great.
But there's one other story, I think,
Please.
that I would be corresponding with these folks, of course, by letters and then by email. And, George was not as, did not change his mind as much as Hamilton on the topic of group selection. And he did it piecemeal. So he changed his mind on sex ratio, which was his best case against group selection in adaptation and natural selection. And he changed his mind about that, which was noble of him. And he changed his mind about disease virulence and became positively enthusiastic about group selection in the context of the evolution of avirulence and diseases as part of his interest in Darwinian medicine. But he did not really change his mind more generally. And I think that he had a worldview that was a kind of an individualistic and somewhat cynical worldview about the absence of goodness in nature. He's famous for saying that Mother Nature is a wicked old witch, right? So paradigmatically, he really didn't change. But in a letter written to me, rather late, he said in the letter, oh yeah, and he figured that group selection was a strong force in human evolution.
Wow, is that right?
And I read this letter, and I said, fuck, is what I said.
Exactly, sure.
Because here's the whole Human Behavior and Evolution Society that is, frankly engaged in hero worship, and is as courageous as they were in the early days about applying evolution to human behavior, and make no mistake, they were courageous and are courageous. They were total doctrinaires about group selection. And so there I had George Williams, their God, telling me that group selection was, he figured, an important force in human evolution. In a private correspondence. Did he publish that anywhere? No.
I think he was trying to torture you.
No, I think this reveals some of the inconsistencies that um, that that exists. But anyhow, let's proceed to your next.
Well, while on the topic of group selection in your work, is there a particular paper, book, that you think has been your most important contribution? And a related question, is there a particular work you've done that you think has been orphaned, that you thought would have a greater impact that has been overlooked?
Well, group selection has been a career-long effort with me, and there's kind of milestones along the way. So our 1993 paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences was a milestone. My article with my book with Elliot Sober, Unto Others, was a milestone and has withstood the test of time. There's very little we change about that book. Darwin's Cathedral was a milestone. And some of the material that we put on Evolution, This View of Life, I think, I'm very proud of. Oh, I wrote a 29-part blog series called Truth and Reconciliation for Group Selection, which has not been published in an academic form, but actually it's, a milestone of sorts. I'm just completing a book called Does Altruism Exist? That will be published by Yale University Press in association with the John Templeton Foundation. But if you go onto the Evolution, This View of Life magazine and just surf that magazine or type in group selection or multi-level selection, I'm very proud of our treatment of that, not just by myself, but the commentary and featuring the critics. So that's one of the things about the magazine, is that it's taking some of these concepts that have been debated for so long in the academic literature, and it's really making them available to a wider audience. And so I really would encourage the viewers of this video, if they want to learn more about multi-level selection, there's a ton of academic stuff by myself and others. Go to Evolution, This View of Life and see how much you can learn that way.
Any of your papers or books you think have been overlooked that you would encourage people to take another look at, that you thought would have a bigger impact than it has?
Right, and I think that I have a couple papers in biology and philosophy on evolutionary epistemology, and especially the concept of beliefs as adaptations and the relationship between the factual content of a belief and the practical content, what it causes you to do. And the observation there, the very elementary observation, is that the mind has evolved to create beliefs that cause you to survive and reproduce, not to apprehend the truth. And so there's a very complex relationship between the factual content of beliefs and their fitness values, and that provides a new basis for epistemology. Now, many evolutionists have made that basic observation, is that we did not evolve directly to apprehend the truth. But I think that developing that is a growth area for evolutionary thought that is still very much in the future. I don't think people really appreciate the foundational consequences of that. And so that, to me, is one of my orphan ideas, as you put it.
Gotcha. Back to HBEST itself, what sorts of things did you do to help HBEST get up and running 25 years ago?
Well, I was not among the founders. I think the first meeting I went to was maybe the second one at Northwestern. And but I was quickly, at that time I was just starting to teach. I was pretty new at Binghamton University. I was teaching evolution and human affairs, and so I was eager to host the meeting, which we did in 1993. Is that right? 1993?
I believe it was 93.
Yeah. And so that was a help. And actually, to tell another story, I thought a good keynote speaker to invite was Stephen Jay Gould.
I've been waiting for this story. Please continue.
And why not report the controversy, right?
Yes, please.
So I invited Steve Gould, and he accepted. And at that point, the other people I was working with, who were the true pioneers, Bill Irons and those folks, they jerked my chain, and they said, no way, that you can't invite, that's like inviting Hitler to a Jewish conference. So you can't do that. And so I actually had to disinvite Stephen Jay Gould. And I said, well, you can come, but not as a plenary. And of course, that was not going to happen. But that actually gives you a little glimpse to the climate of the time. And I think that when I look back at what's called the adaptation wars and the response to sociobiology, starting with the last chapter of Wilson's book, and then very much carrying forward. But let's be clear about this. Wilson's book was published in 1975, and all this HBS stuff got started when? When was the first meeting?
It was probably 92 or 91. Oh, it was, I'm not sure, 89?
I think it was, well, okay, so basically we're talking almost 20 years between HBS getting going and sociobiology, during which the atmosphere about studying evolution relating to human affairs was very oppressive. And who was responsible for that? Many people, but among them, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin. And with a whole story about adaptation and spandrels and so on to go along with it. And these are very deep issues, but the way they became so divisive was an interesting thing for historians to look at. And so I have some sympathy for people like Bill Irons and the other pioneers when they said, no way we're going to invite Stephen Jay Gould, because basically their field that they were trying to establish and their careers, their grants, their publications, and the jobs for younger people all were on the line with this. And so this was consequential. People had skin in the game, as they like to say now.
I'm inclined to think we probably wouldn't see that disinclination to invite a Stephen Jay Gould nowadays. In fact, HBS has invited contrarians like Alice Egley more recently. So I think it makes you can understand why early on they were a bit intolerant of dissent.
Well, there was a bunker mentality, basically.
Yes.
And at the same time, there was a crusader mentality.
Yes. And
I think that you can, and there was also a mentality of really needing to set yourself apart, so that evolutionary psychology was new, and it was like out with the old, in with the new, and so the SSSM had to go, and here was this brave new theory of evolutionary psychology. So you have to, in the first place, you can appreciate that dynamic, but at the same time, you can also appreciate in retrospect how immature it was, and how much maturing needed to be done, and that rate of maturation, how smooth that has been, whether it could have gone faster, and what its current state is. Are we fully mature, or are there still some of these issues, basically, which cause the field of evolution in relation to human affairs to be less unified than it could be? Or is it still a work in progress?
So that's almost predictable, in retrospect at least, about how evolutionary psychologists cordoned themselves off from the likes of Gould, Lewontin, Kamen, what have you. Is there anything else that surprised you in the evolution of HBS more recently over the last 25 years?
Well, I think that the fact that the particular school of thought developed by Cosmides and Tooby became so prominent and became so associated with evolutionary psychology is something that was unfortunate at the time and has taken a long time to undo. And is still with us in a sense, especially because once people form associations, then those associations are hard to undo. And everyone in this field, including yourself, has experiences of talking to someone about evolutionary psychology and then encountering what you would think of as misperceptions about the field. But there's a reason why those misperceptions took place. And so when it comes to issues like massive modularity, for example, and other traditions, and so I think the other main tradition to compare with is that which is centered around the work of Pete Richardson and Rob Boyd on cultural evolution. And when I look at the field of evolution in human affairs today, I find that cultural evolution has become steadily more and more important. In fact, I have an article that I think is on the verge of finishing the review process at Behavioral and Brain Sciences, called Evolving the Future Toward a Science of Intentional Change. It's written with 3 co-authors, Steve Hayes, Tony Biglin, and Dennis Embry. And all of those 3 come from the behaviorist tradition. And the behaviorist tradition never went away. It was excluded from academic psychology before evolutionary psychology made the seed. You're a psychologist, so you know there was the cognitive revolution, right, which deposed behaviorism. And then evolutionary psychology came later, but behaviorism didn't go away. It remained alive and well in the applied behavioral sciences, where it's absolutely essential for therapy and many other real-world applications of behavior change. And so in this review, in this target article for Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the main goal that we want to do is to basically reframe evolutionary psychology to reconcile a seeming paradox. How can you reconcile the fact of elaborate innateness, which is what the Cosmides 2B version of evolutionary psychology is all about, elaborate genetic innateness? How can we reconcile that with elaborate open-ended flexibility? And the Cosmides 2B version of evolutionary psychology had very little to say about transmitted culture. They made a very interesting distinction between transmitted culture and evoked culture. What they said is that if people in different places behave differently, that might not be cultural at all. That might just be them responding. They're just phenotypically plastic as individuals, and they're responding differently to their environment. So if people over here do this and people over there do that, that is not evidence for transmitted culture. Well, good point. That was a very good point. But they did not deny the existence of transmitted culture, but they and the entire field had very little to say about it. Whereas the tradition centered around Richardson and Boyd, and of course the idea of memes and so on, of Dawkins, was very much about that other dimension of humanity, the fact that we are actively evolving culturally, and that cultural change is an evolutionary process, and a very domain general evolutionary process. So the idea that domain generality is theoretically impossible is stupid in retrospect. That's what evolution is a domain general process. So what's been happening is, I think, field-wide, is a maturation, and more we're seeing that we can put these two things together. The fact of elaborate genetic innateness can be put together with the fact of open-ended flexibility. The immune system provides a really good example, and our capacity for behavioral and cultural change is like the immune system. That's something we develop in the article. Now, how much is that reflected in HBAS? I actually haven't gone to the last few meetings. So why don't you tell me how much that's reflected in HBAS?
Probably not as much as you'd like. We could put it that way. We know there are evolutionary psychologists out there that are more domain general than, for example, Tubing Cosmides. Dave Geary comes to mind, for example. But certainly it hasn't progressed in that direction as much as you would like. And I suppose this gets at a distinction that I learned from your graduate students when I was up at Binghamton a couple of months ago between what I think you call evolutionary psychology with a big E or little e evolutionary psychology.
Right.
Imagine this is at the heart of that.
Yeah.
You label yourself more as a lowercase EP, someone who's not fully in bed with the massive modularity and domain specificity that Cosmides and Tubing erected years ago.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, evolutionary psychology is the study of psychology from an evolutionary perspective. And capital EP is a particular school of thought within evolutionary psychology. And words are important. I think when you say something is semantic, you're not disparaging it. So I think it's important to take back the term evolutionary psychology, give it that general usage. So for heaven's sakes, anyone who studies psychology from an evolutionary perspective counts as an evolutionary psychologist. And then we can take the propositions of capital E, capital P, and we can just examine them one by one and let the chips fall where they may. And of course, there's been change in that regard. So if you look at folks, good colleagues like Rob Kurzban would be an example. It's not as if that stuff has been static and set in stone. And after all, here we are, 2012, 13. So that is like, the whole field is like 20 years old. And if you were to think of it in a more of a historical context, 20 years is a very short time. So historians are going to look back and they're going to say, this field that explosively came on the scene and developed very, very fast, even though 20 years is a long time for a human career, an individual's career. It seems slow, but in fact it's very fast. So I think that we can feel optimistic about that.
What else are you optimistic about? That is, in general, what are you looking for HBES to be in the future? What sorts of things beyond what you've just mentioned now that you would like to see researchers pursue more?
Well, I think that I would like to see HBES more activist. And I think that on my own initiative, I started EVOS, Campus-Wide Evolutionary Studies Program, and I've tried to turn it into a consortium. I started the Binghamton Neighborhood Project, which applies evolution to community-based research. And I started a think tank called the Evolution Institute, which formulates public policy from an evolutionary perspective. And as part of that, with the help of my grad student, Rob Kadar, we've started Evolution This View of Life, a magazine that reports anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I'm going to make a boast, which I'm going to say that I've done more than HBES by way of activism. And so if there's a society for promoting evolution in relation to human affair, the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, how activist is it? And I think that it's kind of somewhere along the line, it got into some kind of stasis mode in which it holds its conference and they do their thing. But what else is there? I mean, so why isn't HBES more activist? I actually lay that down as a challenge.
Well, I'll tell you what, you're the first one I'm interviewing. I want to pose that question to some of the others, whether they think it should be more activist. I think it's a great point. Certainly you have been, no question about that. One last question for you. If you could tell your fledgling grad student self one thing, given what you know now, what would you tell yourself back in the day?
Oh, gosh. Things take longer to change than you might think, but I'm not sure that's good advice. I think that's one of my own deceptions, my own self-deceptions, to use a favorite concept of Bobby Trivers, is that it seems that every time I say, this is going to do it, this is the one that's going to do it, and here I am with my white hair at it for 40 years or so. And so these things do take time and it's important not to get disillusioned or frustrated when things move faster. And have fun while you're doing it. And also, make friends with your enemies. Basically, if someone disagrees with you, that can be done with good humor.
Yeah.
And you don't have to get mad. And I think for the most part, I appreciate the fact that that in my discourse with people like George Williams or Richard Dawkins or John Maynard Smith or John and Lee, for the most part, it's been good humor, and so that's extremely important.
I have to say, I'm so indebted to you. I found evolutionary psychology through you. You shared with me your Cosmides and 2B file, so I was able to read them and your notes.
There you go.
Reading it. So I got a little bit of a dose of both, to say the least, and you've been tremendously influential in the development of not only HBEST, but of course evolutionary thinking. And I just want to thank you so much for your time today, David.
Well, thank you, and of course it's you that make it a pleasure to have people like you that are the next generation.
Keep on, and David, have a good one.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.